Are African fat-tailed geckos and leopard geckos the same thing? What morph leopard gecko is this? Is African fat-tailed gecko care the same as leopard gecko care? Can fat-tailed geckos and leopard geckos live together? Now, these are just some of the questions I've been asked when it comes to my African fat-tailed gecko. Now, this girl here is Daisy, and Daisy is my African fat-tailed gecko. She has been featured in a few different videos on my channel here, so some of you may be familiar with her. Now, I feel like there are many people out there who do not actually know exactly what an African fat-tailed gecko is. They do not know the differences between a fat-tail and a leopard gecko, and everything like that. Some people think that a fat-tailed gecko is a type of leopard gecko. They think that their care is the same, so I thought that it was finally time for me to sit down and make a video all about them because I actually get questions about them quite often. Now, I'm sure if you're watching this video, you probably already know what a leopard gecko is. They're probably one of the most common pets kept in the pet trade right now. Probably like the #1 reptile, honestly. They're up there for sure. But not as many people know what an African fat-tailed gecko is, and in my opinion, they are completely underrated reptiles. I'm going to go and put Daisy down for a minute just so I don't have to stand here with my arm sticking up for this whole video, so say goodbye to her for now, but she'll be back. So let's go ahead and start this video off by answering those questions that I said in the very beginning of the video. So #1 question we will answer is an African fat-tailed gecko and a leopard gecko the same thing? The answer to that is no, they are not the same. I believe that many people ask this question or wonder this because of how similar they look. They have a very similar body shape. When it comes to their body, they really do look very similar. So I can see why people who do not know what a fat-tailed gecko is can think this. But to answer the question, no, they are not the same thing. Leopard geckos and fat-tailed geckos are two completely different species. They come from two completely different parts of the world, so no, they are not the same. #2, what morph leopard gecko is that? So this kind of ties in with the first one. African fat-tailed geckos are not a morph of leopard gecko, they are their own species. #3, is African fat-tailed gecko care the same as leopard gecko care? Now, a short answer to that question is no. I can explain more in detail. I'm not going to right now because I will later in the video. But no, their care is not the same. There may be some similarities, but there's also the differences. So no, just because you know how to care for a leopard gecko or you know how to care for a fat-tailed gecko does not mean you can just care for both species the same way, as they have their own requirements. And #4, can I keep leopard geckos and fat-tailed geckos together? The answer to this is definitely, absolutely not. Once again, they are two entirely different species. They do have completely different care requirements. There's no way you can keep them both in the same cage and satisfy both animals because they do have some really drastic needs, and not only that, it just really isn't safe for the animal as well. If you have two together, like if you have a fat-tailed gecko and a leopard gecko together, they can fight, and I guarantee you the leopard gecko will probably win as they tend to be quite a bit larger and even more defensive, I found. So if you keep an African fat-tailed gecko and a leopard gecko together, it will probably not end very well. So please don't do it. So now that I've given like a simple answer to those questions, let's talk about them more in detail. I do want to stress that this is not a care video for either species. I will be touching on a few aspects of their care, but this is by no means a full care guide for either of these animals. It's not a full care guide for leopard geckos, and it's not a full care guide for fat-tailed geckos. So if you are looking to get one of these animals, please don't use this video as a care guide. So we've already really addressed that a fat-tailed gecko and a leopard gecko are not the same thing. There's really no way I can expand on that. It's just a pretty simple answer. They're different animals, they're not the same species, so they're not the same thing, they're different. but I can expand on why they're different. Like, I can talk about their differences and their similarities, the differences in their care and everything like that. So I think that's what I'll go and do and primarily focus on in this video. So I believe that many people are under the assumption that African fat-tailed gecko care is the same as a leopard gecko's care, and I assume that they think this just because the animal looks similar, but I can guarantee you that this is not the answer. Similar appearance does not equal similar care. So let's talk about this. To really understand an animal's care and the animal's needs, you have to look at where the animal is coming from. So let's start with leopard geckos. Leopard geckos typically live in grasslands and highlands of countries in the Middle East. So leopard geckos will live in places such as Pakistan's grasslands, Pakistan's highlands. They will live in the grasslands of Afghanistan, the highlands of Afghanistan. So when you look at these areas, it's a very dry, grassy, rocky place. It doesn't really have many trees or many bushes, a lot of like leaves on the ground, plants on the ground, and stuff like that. It's a fairly dry, open space. So this is typically where you're going to find leopard geckos in the wild. Now let's take a look at African fat-tailed geckos. Now I'm sure by the name you can tell that they come from Africa, specifically West Africa. Fat-tailed geckos do live in multiple different countries all through West Africa, one of them being Senegal. So while many places in West Africa may actually be quite dry, African fat-tailed geckos specifically seek out the humid places. So even though they may live in overall dry countries, they do seek out the humid places, and that's where you will find them. So honestly, in my opinion, the biggest difference when it comes to African fat-tailed geckos and leopard geckos is their humidity. Leopard geckos require very low humidity. You don't want to be like spraying down their cage. You don't want to be keeping them on a substrate that holds in moisture. You want to be keeping them fairly dry, and then typically you will want to provide your leopard gecko with a humid hide just so they can use it to shed. But overall, if the humidity in your leopard gecko's cage is too high, it can cause problems. It can cause things like respiratory infections. So when it comes to leopard geckos, you want to keep it nice and dry. But now when it comes to African fat-tailed geckos, that is definitely not the case. Like I said, they seek out very humid places and live there. So you're going to want to keep your African fat-tailed gecko in a fairly humid environment. As I mentioned with the leopard geckos, most people typically just provide them with a humid hide, but now when it comes to African fat-tailed geckos, this isn't really suitable. African fat-tailed geckos by far need more than just a humid hide. They need humidity throughout their whole enclosure. If the humidity is too low, it can lead to all sorts of issues long term. It can lead to respiratory infections. It can lead to trouble shedding even if they do have a humid hide. And overall, just it will negatively affect their health. So you want the entire cage for your African fat-tailed gecko to have high humidity. You do not just want to use a humid hide, in my opinion. It's not sufficient enough. Where they come from, it's pretty well humid all the time. So that's really what I believe you should be replicating in captivity. They shouldn't have to go in a humid hide just to get the humidity that they need. When you look at where leopard geckos come from versus where fat-tailed geckos come from, you can clearly see that there is a big difference. Where leopard geckos come from, it's a very open space. There's not really like lots of trees and stuff, whereas when you look at where fat-tailed geckos come from, there's all kinds of trees. So when you're setting up their enclosures, I feel like you kind of want to replicate this. Obviously, even though leopard geckos do come from like fairly open spaces, they have lots of rocks and everything to hide under. But when it comes to an African fat-tailed gecko cage, they really do come from very full, lush areas. So I don't think it's good to have them in a fairly open cage. You do want to provide lots of plants, in my opinion, lots of coverage. You know, you really, in my opinion, you really want to replicate where they come from, and where they come from there's all kinds of plants, all kinds of hiding spots, all kinds of rocks and wood and everything like that. So you can really see that there is a difference in their habitats. So in my opinion, that should account for a difference in their enclosures. Well, African fat-tailed geckos and leopard geckos do have their very obvious differences. They do have quite a few similarities. Obviously, you have seen the way they look when it comes to their body shape and everything like that. They do obviously look similar, but there are some similarities in their care as well. For example, both geckos need belly heat to digest their food. You don't really want to use overhead heating. You really should have some sort of heat mat, heat tape, whatever to heat the underneath of their cage to give them warmth, give them heat to help them digest their food. And typically for both animals, you want to keep it around the same temperature. I keep both my leopard gecko and my fat-tailed gecko's hotspot around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and in my opinion, this is a perfect temperature for both of them. And then obviously you will have your cool side of the tank as well, but when it comes to their hotspot, I aim for around 90 degrees. Another similarity would be the fact that they are both insectivores. Leopard geckos' diets are very similar to fat-tailed geckos' diets. They can eat many of the same foods, such as crickets, mealworms, superworms, dubia roaches, waxworms, hornworms, black soldier fly larvae, butterworms, really any feeder insect out there that you can get, they can probably eat. One of the biggest differences that I have noticed when it comes to their eating habits though is I find that African fat-tailed geckos are much pickier than leopard geckos. Now obviously this does not apply to every single gecko. There will be some fat-tailed geckos who are not picky at all, and then there will be some leopard geckos who are extremely picky, but this is just kind of an overall statement. Overall, African fat-tailed geckos tend to be pickier than leopard geckos. Another similarity would be their minimum enclosure size. Now, African fat-tailed geckos do actually tend to be a little smaller than leopard geckos, and because of this, many people do think that they are okay in a smaller cage. Typically, the accepted minimum for a leopard gecko is a 20-gallon long, and now some people will say the minimum for a fat-tailed gecko is a 10-gallon. And personally, I do disagree with this. I feel like if you are using one of those tanks, I feel like a 20-gallon long should also be the minimum for a fat-tailed gecko. Even though they are a little bit smaller, they are really still just as active, I find. So personally, I think that the minimum should be the same for both of them. So as I said, this was just a video to kind of talk about their similarities and differences. By no means is this a care guide. I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about leopard geckos and fat-tailed geckos, learning about the differences between them, learning about the similarities. Hopefully if you were any of these people who were asking questions about them, hopefully this helped you out. Hopefully it answered your questions. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to do that. Also make sure you hit the notification bell so that you get notified whenever I post. And be sure to check out all of my social media. Everything is just EmmaSam99. It will be in the description below. It will all be down there, so check that out. And all of that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time. Say goodbye, Daisy. It's probably not going to focus on you because it's trying to focus on me. I'll have to block me out. Focus on the lizard. Hello, Daisy. Alright, Daisy says thank you for watching. She says subscribe, and we will see you all next time.